The day Winifred Sutherland climbed through her bedroom window in a dress worth more than most families earned in a year, she knew there would be no going back to the gilded cage her father had built around her in St. Louis. The engagement announcement to Charles Pemberton, a man 40 years her senior with hands that felt like death itself whenever they touched her arm, had been printed in the newspaper that very morning. She was 20 years old, and her father had sold her future for a business merger as casually as he might trade cattle. The small carpet bag she carried held only the essentials: 2 simple dresses, her mother's locket, and every dollar she had managed to hide away from her allowance over the past 3 years. It was March of 1876, and the night air still held winter's bite as she made her way through the darkened streets toward the railway station. She had purchased the ticket west under a false name 2 weeks prior, telling the agent she was traveling to meet her husband in the mining territories. The lie had come easily, born of desperation, and the certain knowledge that staying meant a lifetime of suffocating beneath Charles Pemberton's ownership. Her father would come looking for her. Charles would demand his purchased bride be returned. But Winifred had researched carefully, and she knew that once she reached the territories, once she disappeared into the vast expanse of the West, finding one woman would be like finding a single grain of sand in an endless desert. The train journey took 4 days, and with each mile that separated her from St. Louis, Winifred felt the tight bands around her chest loosen incrementally. She kept to herself, speaking to no one, eating sparingly from the provisions she had packed. Other passengers came and went at various stops, but she kept her face turned toward the window, watching civilization gradually give way to wilderness. By the time the train reached Denver, her fine dress was rumpled and dusty, and she looked more like a weary traveler than the daughter of one of St. Louis's wealthiest merchants. From Denver, she took a smaller line that ran into the mountains, climbing higher into territory that felt impossibly remote. The conductor announced they would be stopping at Black Hawk, Colorado, a mining town nestled in the Rocky Peaks where men sought their fortunes in gold and silver. Winifred had chosen it precisely because it seemed like the sort of place where a woman could disappear, where the constant flow of new arrivals meant one more face would go unnoticed. What she had not anticipated was how unwelcoming a mining town could be to a woman traveling alone. The moment she stepped off the train onto the rough wooden platform, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her. Black Hawk was a place of mud streets and hastily constructed buildings, where the sound of pickaxes rang out from the surrounding hills, and the air itself seemed to taste of stone dust and ambition. The few women she could see were either hurrying with purpose toward specific destinations or standing in doorways with painted faces and hard eyes. Winifred clutched her carpetbag tighter and tried to walk with confidence toward what appeared to be a boarding house at the end of the street. She made it perhaps 20 yards before a man stepped directly into her path. He was unshaven, his clothes stiff with dirt, and his smile revealed several missing teeth. "Well now, what do we have here? You looking for work, honey?" "Because Sal's place is back that way, and she always needs fresh girls." Winifred's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Excuse me, I need to pass." "Oh, she needs to pass," the man said mockingly, glancing back at 2 companions who had emerged from the shadows between buildings. "Hear that, boys? The fancy lady needs to pass." Another voice cut through the tension, low and calm but carrying an edge of authority that made the men pause. "The lady asked you to move, Garrett. I suggest you do it." Winifred turned to see a man standing perhaps 10 feet away, one hand resting casually on the gun belt at his hip. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of creek water in sunlight. His clothing was worn but clean: dark trousers, a simple shirt, a leather vest, and a hat that had seen better days. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, except for the way he held himself, utterly still and completely certain. The man called Garrett seemed to weigh his options for a long moment before spitting into the mud and stepping aside. "Didn't mean no harm, Fletcher. Just being friendly to a newcomer." "I am sure," the stranger said, his tone suggesting he believed nothing of the sort. He waited until Garrett and his companions had moved away before turning his attention to Winifred. "Miss, Black Hawk is not the kind of place where a woman should be walking alone. Do you have someone meeting you?" The kindness in his question nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. Winifred straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I can manage, thank you. I appreciate your assistance, but I do not require further help." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "That carpetbag says different. You are new to town. You have got nobody meeting you, and you have got about 3 minutes before every fortune hunter and worse in this place figures out you are alone. Now, I am going to ask you one more time, and I would appreciate an honest answer. Do you have anywhere to go?" The word "no" sat on her tongue, but admitting that felt like admitting defeat. Winifred had fled St. Louis believing she could simply start over, that determination and careful planning would be enough. Standing in the muddy street of this rough mountain town, she realized how naive that assumption had been. "I was going to inquire about a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen's place is full up. Has been for 2 weeks since they struck a new vein up at the Gilded Lady mine." He studied her for a moment, and Winifred had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly assessed. "What brought you to Black Hawk, if you do not mind my asking?" "I do mind, actually." The words came out sharper than she intended, born of exhaustion and fear and the weight of the choice she had made. Instead of taking offense, the man simply nodded. "Fair enough. But you need to understand something, miss. This town eats up people who are running from something. It has got no patience and less mercy. Whatever you are running from, you had better be sure what you are running to is worth it. And what business is that of yours?" Winifred demanded, suddenly angry at this stranger for seeing through her so easily, for voicing the doubts she had been pushing down since St. Louis. "None at all," he admitted. "Except I got a ranch about 8 miles from here, and my housekeeper quit last week to move back east with her daughter. It is not much, just me and my foreman and about 200 head of cattle, but it has got a spare room and honest work if you want it. Pay is $30 a month plus room and board." Winifred stared at him, trying to determine if this was some elaborate trap. "You are offering me employment. You do not even know my name." "Fletcher Walsh," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both casual and courtly. "And you are right. I do not know your name. I also do not know what brought you here or what you are running from. But I know desperation when I see it, and I know what happens to desperate people in towns like this. So I am offering you a choice. You can try your luck here in Black Hawk, or you can come work at my ranch where nobody is going to bother you and nobody is going to ask questions you do not want to answer." Every instinct told her this was too easy, too convenient. Yet as Winifred looked around at the rough faces watching them with undisguised interest, at the ramshackle buildings and muddy streets, she realized her options were severely limited. At least at her ranch, she would be away from the constant scrutiny of town life. At least there, she might have time to figure out what came next. "My name is Winifred," she said finally, keeping her surname to herself. "And I accept your offer, Mr. Walsh." The ride to Fletcher Walsh's ranch took nearly 2 hours, following a winding trail that climbed higher into the mountains. Winifred sat beside him on the wagon bench, her carpetbag at her feet, watching the landscape transform around them. Pine trees rose like sentinels on either side of the path, and in the distance, peaks still crowned with snow scraped the belly of the sky. Fletcher drove with the ease of someone who had made this journey countless times, pointing out landmarks occasionally, but otherwise respecting the silence that had fallen between them. The ranch, when it finally came into view, was more substantial than Winifred had expected. A sturdy log house with a wide porch faced east, positioned to catch the morning sun. Behind it stood a barn, several outbuildings and corrals where cattle grazed on the emerging spring grass. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as they approached, a man emerged from the barn wiping his hands on a rag. "That is Tom Brennan, my foreman," Fletcher said, guiding the wagon toward the house. "He has been with me since I started this place 3 years ago. He is a good man, a bit gruff but fair." Tom Brennan proved to be in his 50s, weathered by sun and work, with keen eyes that took in Winifred's arrival with obvious curiosity, but no judgment. Fletcher made brief introductions, explaining only that Winifred would be taking over the housekeeping duties. If Tom found this arrangement unusual, he gave no sign, simply nodding politely before returning to his work. The interior of the house was clean but clearly lacking a woman's touch. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy table taking up the center. 2 doors led off to what Winifred assumed were bedrooms. Everything was functional and well-made but sparse, as though Fletcher had acquired only what was absolutely necessary and nothing more. "Your room is there," Fletcher said, indicating the door on the left. "I am on the other side. There is a lock on your door and I expect you to use it. Tom has a cabin out by the barn. As for the work, it is mostly cooking and cleaning, some mending when needed. I get up before dawn, usually back by late afternoon unless we are moving cattle or dealing with some emergency. We do not keep fancy hours out here." Winifred set down her carpetbag and turned to face him directly. "Mr. Walsh, I need to understand something. Why did you help me? Why offer me this position without knowing anything about me?" Fletcher removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested he had been expecting this question. "About 6 years ago, I was in a bad situation. Made some mistakes, owed money to people who do not forgive debts. A man I barely knew gave me a stake to start over, asked nothing in return except that I pass the favor forward when I could. I have been looking for the right opportunity." He paused, then added quietly, "Also, I had a sister once. She got into trouble, needed help, and nobody stepped forward. By the time I found out, it was too late, so maybe I am just hoping that somewhere, somehow, it balances out." The raw honesty in his words caught Winifred off guard. She had been braced for ulterior motives, for demands or expectations. Instead, she found only a straightforward offer born of old grief and the desire to make something right. "I am sorry about your sister. Me too." Fletcher settled his hat back on his head. "Look, I am not going to pry into whatever brought you here. But I need you to know that if someone comes looking for you, if whoever you are running from shows up, I need to know what I am dealing with. I will not hand you over, but I will not be blindsided either." It was a fair request, more than fair considering he was offering her sanctuary without knowing her story. Winifred took a breath and made a decision. "I am running from a forced engagement. My father arranged for me to marry a man I find repulsive, and I chose to leave rather than submit to a lifetime of misery. My father is wealthy and well connected, and I suspect he will hire people to search for me. I am truly sorry to bring that potential trouble to your door." Fletcher considered this for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right, then. First thing we need to do is establish a story. If anyone comes asking, you are my wife. We got married in Denver 3 months ago before I came back to the ranch. That will give you the protection of my name and explain why nobody in town has met you yet." "Your wife," Winifred repeated, startled by the suggestion. "Mr. Walsh, I cannot possibly—" "It is the only thing that will work," Fletcher interrupted, his tone practical rather than romantic. "A housekeeper traveling alone, people will still ask questions. A wife is different. A wife has every right to be here, and any man who bothers a married woman in these parts is going to have to answer to her husband. It is just a story, something to tell folks in town. Out here on the ranch, we know the truth." The logic was sound, even if the situation felt impossibly strange. Winifred had fled one unwanted marriage only to find herself claiming another, albeit a fictional one. Yet there was a certain safety in the arrangement, a legitimacy that would shield her from the very questions and attention she hoped to avoid. "And if my father's men do come, if they discover I am here, then we will deal with it," Fletcher said simply. "But they will find a married woman under the protection of her husband, not a runaway girl with no one to speak for her. In the eyes of the law, that makes a difference." He was right, though Winifred hated the reality that made it so. Women had few rights, few options, few paths that did not require a man's permission or protection. At least this arrangement was one she had chosen, a fiction she had agreed to rather than a reality forced upon her. "Very well, but I insist on doing my work properly. I will not have you feeling you made a poor bargain." Something that might have been respect flickered across Fletcher's face. "I do not imagine I will. Now, why do not you get settled in, and I will show you around properly tomorrow. It has been a long day for both of us." That night, lying in a narrow bed in a stranger's house 800 miles from everything she had ever known, Winifred waited for panic to set in. Instead, she felt only a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with the faint stirrings of something that might have been hope. Outside her window, the mountain night sang with unfamiliar sounds. The distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine trees, the settling sounds of a house built with careful hands. She thought of her father discovering her empty room, of Charles Pemberton's fury at being denied his purchased bride. Let them be angry. Let them search. She was Winifred Walsh now, at least in name, and perhaps that fiction would be enough to keep her free. Morning came early to the ranch, announced by the crow of a rooster and the sound of Fletcher moving around in the main room, building up the fire. Winifred dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, braided her honey-colored hair, and emerged to find him already pulling on his work gloves. "There is coffee on the stove," he said, gesturing toward the pot warming over the fire. "Tom and I will be out checking the herd in the north pasture. We should be back around noon. Do not worry about anything fancy for meals, just whatever you can manage. The pantry is through there. Root cellar is outside around the back. If you need anything or if anyone comes by, ring the bell on the porch. We will hear it." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a solid thunk that left Winifred alone in the quiet house. She poured herself coffee and stood at the window, watching Fletcher and Tom ride out, their figures growing smaller against the vast landscape. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly breathe. The work of running the household proved both challenging and oddly satisfying. Winifred had grown up in a house with servants, where her education had focused on watercolors and French and playing the piano, skills meant to make her an ornamental wife. She knew nothing of cooking over a wood stove or hauling water or any of the 100 practical tasks required to maintain a working ranch. But she was intelligent and determined, and she threw herself into learning with the same intensity she had once devoted to her escape plans. The first meals she prepared were barely edible, the bread too dense, the stew somehow both burnt and undercooked. Fletcher ate without complaint, though Winifred caught him and Tom exchanging glances across the table. By the end of the first week, however, she had begun to find her rhythm. The bread rose properly, the coffee was strong and hot, and she discovered she had an unexpected talent for making pies from dried fruit and precious sugar. More than the physical work, Winifred found herself fascinated by the rhythm of ranch life. Everything operated on cycles dictated by the cattle, the weather, the seasons. Fletcher worked from before dawn until after dusk, his days filled with mending fences, checking on pregnant cows, breaking horses, and the endless maintenance that kept a ranch functioning. He spoke little, but moved with an economy and purpose that suggested a deep understanding of his work. Tom was similarly taciturn, though occasionally he would share a story from his years in the cattle business, tales of long drives and hard winters that made the present challenges seem manageable by comparison. As the days turned into weeks, a cautious friendship began to develop between Winifred and Fletcher. They still knew relatively little about each other's pasts, maintaining the unspoken agreement not to pry. But in the present, they learned each other's habits and preferences. Fletcher liked his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. Winifred hummed while she worked, old hymns her mother had taught her. Fletcher read the newspaper when he could get it from town, his brow furrowing at news of Indian conflicts and railroad expansions. Winifred discovered books tucked on a shelf in his room, novels by Dickens and Twain that surprised her with their well-worn pages. "My mother was a schoolteacher," Fletcher explained one evening when he caught her examining the small library. "She made sure I could read before I could ride. Said a man needed both skills to make his way in the world." "She sounds like a wise woman," Winifred said, running her fingers along the spines. "She was." Fletcher stared into the fire, his expression distant. "She died when I was 16, fever. My father followed her a year later. I think he just did not want to keep going without her." It was the most personal information he had shared, and Winifred found herself responding in kind. "My mother died when I was 12. She was thrown from a horse during a hunt. My father buried his grief in his business, and I buried mine in books and plans to attend university, which of course he would never allow." "You wanted to go to university?" Fletcher asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I wanted to study medicine," Winifred admitted. "I wanted to be a doctor, to actually do something useful with my life rather than simply decorating some man's parlor. But that was never a possibility, not for someone like me. Women like me are meant to marry well and produce heirs and pretend we are content with tiny, airless lives." "That is why you ran." "That is why I ran," she confirmed. "Though I suspect my father would argue I was being hysterical and ungrateful. He provided everything money could buy except the one thing I truly wanted, which was the freedom to choose my own path." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then said, "You have got that freedom now. It might not look the way you imagined it, but it is yours." He was right. This life, with its early mornings and hard work and simple pleasures, was hers in a way nothing in St. Louis had ever been. There was a satisfaction in that realization, a sense of rightness that settled somewhere deep in her chest. In late April, Fletcher announced they needed to make a trip into Black Hawk for supplies. "It is also time people saw you," he added. "We have been putting it off, but talk will start if I do not bring my wife to town eventually." "Are you ready for that?" Winifred had known this moment would come. Maintaining the fiction of their marriage meant performing it publicly, meant facing down the curiosity and judgment of the townspeople. She nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "What do I need to know? Just follow my lead," Fletcher said. "We got married in Denver 3 months ago before the heavy snows cleared. You are from back east originally, but you do not need to say where specifically. We met when you were traveling through on your way to California, and I convinced you to stay. Keep it simple, and do not volunteer information people do not ask for." The ride into town felt different this time, with Fletcher beside her and the weight of their shared fiction resting between them. He drove the wagon with easy competence, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history. As they descended into Black Hawk's Main Street, Winifred noticed several people turning to stare, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. Fletcher helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy, his hand lingering at her elbow in a way that suggested husbandly protectiveness. The first stop was the general store, where a sharp-eyed woman behind the counter looked Winifred up and down with undisguised interest. "Mrs. Patterson, I would like you to meet my wife, Winifred," Fletcher said smoothly. "We got married down in Denver this winter." "Is that so?" Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested deep skepticism. "Funny, nobody mentioned you going to Denver for a wedding, Fletcher Walsh." "Because nobody knew about it," Fletcher replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "It was a quick ceremony, and we decided to keep it quiet until Winifred could get settled at the ranch." "Well," Mrs. Patterson sniffed but appeared somewhat mollified. "Welcome to Black Hawk, Mrs. Walsh. I am sure you will find it quite different from wherever you came from." "I am sure I will," Winifred agreed, mustering a smile. "Mr. Walsh speaks very highly of the community here." They made their way through the store, selecting flour and sugar and coffee and other necessities. Fletcher kept close, occasionally touching her shoulder or speaking in a low voice that suggested intimacy. To anyone watching, they would have appeared as a normal married couple going about their errands. Only Winifred could feel the tension in Fletcher's shoulders, the watchful way he tracked who was nearby. Their second stop was at the land office, where Fletcher needed to file some paperwork regarding his property boundaries. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, barely glanced at Winifred until Fletcher mentioned, almost casually, "I need to update my records. This is my wife, Winifred Walsh. We got married back in March." The clerk's pen paused mid-stroke. "You got married? I had not heard that." "Small ceremony," Fletcher said, "but I want it noted officially that she has rights to the property should anything happen to me." It was a detail they had not discussed, and Winifred felt her breath catch. Fletcher was not simply maintaining their fiction for public consumption. He was making it legally binding. If something happened to him, if he died or was injured, she would have claim to the ranch. It was an extraordinary level of trust, an action that spoke of commitment far beyond their business arrangement. The clerk made his notations, had Fletcher sign several documents, and filed everything away with bureaucratic efficiency. As they left the office, Winifred touched Fletcher's arm, stopping him on the wooden sidewalk. "You did not have to do that. The property rights, I mean. That was not part of our agreement." Fletcher met her eyes steadily. "I know. But if I am going to claim you as my wife, then you deserve the protections that come with it. Not just the pretense, but the reality. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you make decent coffee and your pies are getting better. That is worth something." The warmth in his voice took the sting out of what might have been insulting, transforming it instead into something close to affection. Winifred found herself smiling back, aware that something between them was shifting, that the careful boundaries they had maintained were beginning to blur in ways both dangerous and exhilarating. They ate lunch at a small restaurant, enduring more curious stares and intrusive questions from townspeople who clearly found Fletcher's sudden marriage surprising. He fielded each inquiry with patience, spinning their story with enough detail to be convincing but not so much as to invite deeper investigation. Winifred played her part, the dutiful wife pleased to meet her husband's acquaintances, carefully neutral about her own background. It was exhausting, maintaining the constant performance, and by the time they loaded the supplies and headed back toward the ranch, Winifred felt wrung out. Fletcher seemed to sense her fatigue, driving in companionable silence until the town disappeared behind them and the open trail stretched ahead. "You did well," he said finally. "I know that was not easy." "Does it get easier?" Winifred asked. "The pretending?" Fletcher considered the question. "I do not know, but maybe it matters less with time. Maybe the line between pretending and reality just gets harder to see." His words echoed in Winifred's mind long after they returned to the ranch. That night, preparing dinner while Fletcher and Tom saw to the evening chores, she found herself wondering what, exactly, they were building here. A fiction, yes, but fictions had a way of taking on weight and substance when enough people believed in them. And more troubling, she had to admit she was beginning to enjoy the fiction, to take comfort in the idea of being Fletcher Walsh's wife, even if only in name. Spring deepened into summer, and the ranch work intensified. Fletcher and Tom were often gone for days at a time, moving cattle to higher pastures or repairing fence lines damaged by winter storms. Winifred found herself managing the household with increasing confidence, taking pride in keeping everything running smoothly in their absence. She also discovered an unexpected talent with animals, coaxing a half-wild barn cat to trust her enough to bring her kittens into the house, successfully nursing an injured calf back to health when it was abandoned by its mother. On evenings when Fletcher was home, they fell into the habit of sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains. These were the times Winifred treasured most, when the day's work was done and the air cooled, and they could simply exist side by side without performance or pretense. "Tell me about your ranch," Winifred asked one such evening. "How did you come to own this land?" Fletcher stretched his legs out, his boots scuffed and worn from the day's riding. "Bought it cheap about 3 years ago from a man who had given up trying to make it work. He had been panning for gold, thought he would strike it rich, but mining takes more luck than most people have. So he sold me the land and buildings for about half what he paid, and I used the rest of my stake to buy cattle. First year was rough, lost almost a quarter of the herd to a hard winter. Second year was better. This year, if the prices hold, I might actually turn a real profit. Do you enjoy it?" Winifred asked. "The work, the life out here, I do," Fletcher said simply. "It is hard and uncertain, and there are days I wonder if I am crazy for trying. But it is mine, you know. Everything I build here, I build with my own hands and my own decisions. Nobody telling me what to do or who to be. I reckon that is worth the struggle." Winifred understood that sentiment intimately, the deep human need for autonomy and self-determination. "I feel the same way about being here. Even though I am just keeping house and cooking meals, it feels important because I chose it. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Fletcher agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, when I first offered you this position, I figured you would stay maybe a month or two, just until you got your bearings. I did not expect you to take to ranch life the way you have." "I did not expect to either," Winifred admitted. "I thought I would hate the isolation, the hard work, but there is something freeing about it, about knowing exactly what needs to be done and doing it well, about going to bed exhausted and waking up with purpose. You are not sorry you came then?" Winifred looked at him, really looked at him in the fading light. Fletcher Walsh was not a handsome man in the conventional sense, his features too weathered, his hands too rough from work. But there was something compelling about him, a steadiness and honesty that made her feel safe in ways she never had in her father's mansion. "No," she said softly, "I am not sorry at all." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Fletcher cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "I should check on that mare in the barn. She is close to foaling and I want to keep an eye on her." He left quickly, and Winifred remained on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. Her heart was beating faster than the moment warranted, and she had to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Fletcher Walsh. Not because he had rescued her or given her sanctuary, but because of who he was, principled and hardworking and unexpectedly gentle. Because he made her laugh with his dry observations about the chickens' personalities. Because he listened when she talked about the books she read as though her opinions mattered. Because when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with her father's money or her face or any other surface quality. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and completely impossible. Their arrangement was meant to be temporary, a fiction to protect her until she could figure out what came next. Falling in love with him was not part of the plan, was in fact a complication that could destroy the careful equilibrium they had established. Yet there it was, undeniable and growing stronger with each passing day. In early July, the complication Winifred had been dreading arrived in the form of 3 men on horseback. She was hanging laundry when they rode into the yard, and her heart seized with instant recognition. She did not know them personally, but their type was unmistakable. Hired detectives, probably Pinkertons, the kind of men her father would employ to track down his wayward daughter. Tom was working nearby, and he stepped out of the barn immediately, his hand resting casually on the rifle he always kept within reach. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with calculating eyes, touched his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and threatening. "Afternoon. We are looking for Fletcher Walsh. He is up in the north pasture," Tom said, his tone giving nothing away. "Can I help you with something? We are looking for a missing woman," the man said, pulling a photograph from his jacket. "Young lady, about 20 years old, blonde hair, answers to Winifred Sutherland. Her family is desperate to find her. She went missing back in St. Louis about 3 months ago." Winifred's hands had frozen on the sheet she was hanging, but she forced herself to keep working, to act as though this conversation had nothing to do with her. Tom took the photograph and studied it with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Pretty girl, but I have not seen her around here." "You are sure about that?" The detective's gaze had shifted to Winifred, taking in her simple dress and work-worn hands. "Because we heard Fletcher Walsh brought a woman back to this ranch around the same time Miss Sutherland disappeared." "You heard right," Tom confirmed. "That is Fletcher's wife, Winifred Walsh. They got married down in Denver back in March, but she is not who you are looking for." The detective dismounted and approached Winifred directly. She straightened, meeting his eyes with as much composure as she could muster. Up close, she could see he was not fooled by Tom's explanation. He knew exactly who she was. "Mrs. Walsh, is it?" His voice was oily with false courtesy. "Funny thing, the woman we are looking for has the same first name. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Before Winifred could respond, Fletcher's voice cut across the yard. "I would mind very much." He strode toward them, and Winifred felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost painful. Fletcher positioned himself between her and the detective, his posture deceptively relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. This is private property, and you are interrogating my wife without my permission. I suggest you state your business and move on." The detective studied Fletcher with the same calculating assessment he had turned on Winifred. "We are looking for Winifred Sutherland, daughter of Marcus Sutherland of St. Louis. She disappeared 3 months ago under suspicious circumstances. Her father has hired us to bring her home safely." "I wish you luck," Fletcher said evenly. "But as you can see, the only Winifred here is my wife, and she is exactly where she wants to be." "Is that so?" The detective shifted his attention back to Winifred. "Miss Sutherland, if you are being held against your will, you need only say so. Your father wants you to know he forgives you, and that Mr. Pemberton is willing to overlook this unfortunate incident." The mention of Charles Pemberton's name made Winifred's stomach turn. She stepped closer to Fletcher, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I am not Miss Sutherland. I am Mrs. Walsh, and I am not being held against my will. I am home with my husband, and I would appreciate it if you would leave our property. You see," Fletcher added, his voice dropping into something dangerous, "that is my wife you are harassing. Now, I am a reasonable man, but I do not take kindly to strangers upsetting her. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to get back on your horses, and you are going to ride out of here. And if you come back, if you bother my wife again, we are going to have a very different kind of conversation." The detective held his ground for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he tucked the photograph back into his jacket. "Mr. Walsh, if your wife has any information about Miss Sutherland's whereabouts, it would be very helpful to her family." "She does not," Fletcher said flatly. "Good day, gentlemen." The 3 men remounted with obvious reluctance, and the lead detective delivered one final warning. "Marcus Sutherland is a very determined man. He is not going to stop looking for his daughter." "Then he is wasting his money," Fletcher replied, "because she is not here." They watched the detectives ride away, the silence stretching until the figures disappeared around the bend in the trail. Only then did Winifred allow herself to breathe, her knees suddenly weak. Fletcher turned to her, his expression concerned. "Are you all right? They know," Winifred whispered. "They know exactly who I am. The photograph, the timing, everything matches. My father is not going to give up just because we denied it." "No, probably not," Fletcher agreed. "But here is the thing they cannot get around. You are legally married to me. I filed the paperwork in Black Hawk, and as far as any court is concerned, you are Winifred Walsh. Your father cannot claim you are being held against your will when you are standing on your own property, freely stating you want to be here. And Charles Pemberton has no claim on you at all." "But we are not actually married," Winifred protested. "It is all fiction, a story we told to protect me." "If my father challenges it, if he demands proof," Fletcher caught her hands, stilling their anxious movements. "Winifred, listen to me. That paperwork I filed is real. In the eyes of the law, we are married. The only thing that makes a marriage is the agreement between 2 people and the legal documentation. Everything else is just ceremony." Winifred stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You made it real. You actually married me without asking." "I made us legally married so you would be protected," Fletcher clarified. "But I am not claiming anything beyond that. You are still free to leave whenever you want. The paperwork just means your father cannot force you to do anything against your will." It was an extraordinary thing he had done, taking on a legal commitment to protect her while asking nothing in return. Winifred found tears pricking at her eyes, overwhelmed by the generosity and the risk he had assumed on her behalf. "Why would you do that? You could have just sent me away, avoided all this trouble." "Because I could not live with myself if I let them take you back to something you were running from," Fletcher said simply. "And because somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a business arrangement for me." His confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Winifred met his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected back at her. Hope and fear, and the dawning realization that what had started as convenience had transformed into something real. "For me too," she admitted. "I did not plan on this. I did not plan on you." "I know," Fletcher said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was tender and tentative. "But here we are anyway." "Here we are," Winifred echoed. Then, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, she stepped closer and kissed him. The kiss was soft and careful, a question more than a declaration. Fletcher went very still for a heartbeat, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close as he deepened the kiss with a hunger that spoke of weeks of restrained desire. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Winifred could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. "We should probably talk about this," Fletcher said, his voice rough. "Probably," Winifred agreed. "But I am tired of being sensible and careful. I spent my whole life doing what was expected, following rules designed to keep me small and controlled. I ran away to have a choice, and I am choosing this. I am choosing you if you will have me." "If I will have you," Fletcher laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Winifred, I have been half in love with you since you stood in that muddy street in Black Hawk and told me you did not need help while clearly drowning. You are the most stubborn, determined, surprising woman I have ever met. And yes, I will absolutely have you." They kissed again, longer and deeper this time, with the certainty of mutual feeling rather than tentative exploration. Tom, who had been maintaining a discreet distance by the barn, chose that moment to clear his throat loudly. "Hate to interrupt, but those men might come back with more friends. We should probably make some plans." Fletcher reluctantly released Winifred but kept one arm around her waist, anchoring her to his side. "You are right. Let us go inside and figure out what comes next." What came next involved a tense discussion around the kitchen table about security and contingency plans. Tom suggested posting watches at night in case the detectives returned with reinforcements. Fletcher wanted to ride into town and speak with the sheriff, ensuring there was a legal record of their marriage and Winifred's willingness to remain at the ranch. Winifred proposed writing a letter to her father, explicitly stating her choice and demanding he cease his pursuit. "Will he respect that?" Fletcher asked. "Probably not," Winifred admitted. "My father believes he knows what is best for me better than I know myself, and Charles Pemberton is not a man who accepts being denied something he thinks he has purchased. But at least it establishes a clear record of my intentions." They spent the evening drafting the letter, with Winifred choosing each word carefully to convey both her resolve and her understanding of the finality of her choice. She explained that she had married Fletcher Walsh, that she was happy and safe, and that any attempt to forcibly remove her would be met with legal resistance. She did not apologize, though part of her wanted to, trained as she was to soothe and placate. Instead, she simply stated facts and demanded they be respected. Fletcher rode into Black Hawk the next morning to mail the letter and speak with Sheriff Morrison. He returned late in the afternoon with news that was both encouraging and concerning. Morrison says legally, they cannot do anything. You are an adult woman, married, and clearly here of your own free will. But he also warned that men like your father sometimes do not care about legal niceties. He suggested we be careful and keep an eye out for trouble. So we just wait. Winifred asked, hating the passive position it put them in. We wait and we stay alert, Fletcher confirmed. But we also keep living our lives. I refuse to let your father's threats turn this place into a prison. Over the following weeks, they maintained vigilance while also settling into their new dynamic as an acknowledged couple. The shift from pretense to reality was surprisingly seamless, as though they had simply been waiting for permission to act on feelings that had been building for months. Fletcher would reach for Winifred's hand while they sat on the porch. Winifred would kiss his cheek before he rode out in the morning, small gestures of affection that felt monumental in their significance. They also began sharing a bed, though Fletcher was exquisitely careful about respecting Winifred's boundaries. The first night, he had simply held her, both of them fully clothed, talking quietly until they fell asleep in each other's arms. Intimacy came gradually, built on trust and genuine affection rather than obligation or expectation. Winifred found herself marveling at how different it was to be with someone who cared about her pleasure and comfort, who saw her as a partner rather than a possession. Tom, for his part, adapted to the changed circumstances with equanimity, occasionally making dry comments about newlyweds that made them both laugh. The ranch work continued its seasonal rhythms, and Winifred threw herself into improving her skills, determined to be genuinely useful rather than simply decorative. In late August, nearly 5 months after Winifred's arrival, a letter arrived bearing her father's seal. Fletcher brought it to her wordlessly, and Winifred opened it with shaking hands. The contents were exactly what she expected. Fury thinly disguised as concern, demands that she return immediately, threats of disinheritance, and a flat refusal to acknowledge her marriage as legitimate. He says Fletcher is clearly some kind of fortune hunter who took advantage of my temporary insanity, Winifred said, her voice wavering between anger and hurt. He says Charles is willing to forgive my transgression if I come home immediately, and that he will use every resource at his disposal to bring me back. Fletcher read over her shoulder, his jaw tight. Let him try. We have got the law on our side, and I will be damned if I let anyone take you against your will. He is a powerful man, Winifred warned. Rich, well-connected, used to getting his way. He could make our lives very difficult. Then our lives will be difficult, Fletcher said firmly. But they will be ours. That is what matters. His certainty steadied her, reminding Winifred why she had chosen this path in the first place. Freedom was not about ease or comfort. It was about the fundamental right to make her own choices and live with the consequences. She folded the letter and fed it into the stove, watching the expensive paper curl and blacken. Then let him come. We will face it together. As it turned out, Marcus Sutherland's next move was more insidious than direct confrontation. In September, a lawyer arrived from Denver, bearing documents that challenged the legitimacy of Winifred's marriage on the grounds that she had been mentally incompetent at the time due to temporary insanity. The claim was absurd but legally complex, designed to tie them up in courts and drain their resources. Fletcher hired his own lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine Preston, who had a reputation for winning difficult cases. She reviewed the documents and gave them a frank assessment. This is harassment, pure and simple. They know they do not have a real case, but they are betting you will not have the money or stamina to fight a prolonged legal battle. My advice is to countersue for harassment and file a restraining order against Marcus Sutherland and his agents. Will that work? Winifred asked. It will make the fight expensive for him too, Catherine said. And it establishes that you are not backing down. Men like your father are used to intimidating people into submission. When someone pushes back, they often reconsider the cost-benefit analysis. They followed Catherine's advice, and for weeks, Winifred lived with the constant anxiety of impending legal action. Every rider approaching the ranch set her heart racing. Every trip to town carried the risk of encountering her father's agents. Fletcher remained steadfast throughout, his calm presence the only thing that kept her from spiraling into panic. The break came in mid-October, when Catherine sent word that Marcus Sutherland was withdrawing his legal challenge. The letter she forwarded from his lawyer was terse and made no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it clearly stated he was ceasing all attempts to interfere in his daughter's life. Catherine included her own note explaining that she had made it known. They were prepared to file a very public lawsuit detailing Sutherland's attempts to force his daughter into an unwanted marriage with a man 40 years her senior. Apparently, the potential scandal was more costly than letting you go, she wrote. Winifred read the letter 3 times, unable to fully believe it. It is over. Just like that. Looks like it, Fletcher said, though his tone suggested cautious optimism rather than certainty. Your father decided you were not worth the public embarrassment. It should have felt like victory, but instead, Winifred found herself crying, overwhelmed by the confirmation that her father had only valued her as a commodity. When the cost of retrieving her became too high, he had simply written her off, not because he respected her choices, but because protecting his reputation mattered more. Fletcher held her through the tears, not offering empty platitudes but simply being present while she grieved the father she had never really had. I am sorry, she finally said, wiping her eyes. I know I should be relieved. You can be both, Fletcher said gently. Relieved and sad at the same time. Feelings do not have to make perfect sense. His understanding, his acceptance of her complicated emotions without trying to fix them, was one of the things Winifred loved most about him. Fletcher did not need her to be anything other than what she was, flawed and fierce and figuring things out as she went. It was a kind of love she had not known existed, built on respect and partnership rather than ownership. As autumn deepened and the aspen trees turned gold against the evergreen pines, Winifred found herself experiencing a contentment she had never imagined possible. The work was hard, the winters promised to be brutal, and their finances were always precarious. But she was free in ways that transcended physical location or material comfort. She was building a life on her own terms, with a man who saw her as an equal, and that was worth every sacrifice. In November, Fletcher proposed making their marriage real in more than just legal documentation. I know we are already married on paper, he said, holding both her hands as they stood in the kitchen after dinner. But I want to do it right. I want to stand up in front of people and make promises to you that I actually mean, not just words for show. I want you to know that I choose you every day for the rest of my life. Winifred felt tears gathering again, but this time they were born of joy rather than grief. You do not have to do that. We are already committed. I know I do not have to, Fletcher said. I want to. I want you to have a real wedding, the kind you deserve, not a piece of paperwork filed in desperation. So what do you say? Will you marry me, Winifred Walsh, for real this time? Yes, Winifred said, laughing through her tears. Yes, absolutely yes. They planned a small ceremony for December, inviting only a handful of people. Tom, of course, and Mrs. Patterson from the general store, and Sheriff Morrison, and Catherine Preston, who had fought their legal battles. The local minister agreed to officiate, and they held the ceremony in the ranch house, decorated with pine boughs and candles that cast warm light over the simple proceedings. Winifred wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Fletcher had surprised her with, a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Fletcher wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed and his hands scrubbed clean of the ever-present dirt from ranch work. When he said his vows, his voice steady and sure, Winifred knew she was hearing promises that would be kept. I take you, Winifred, as my wife and partner. I promise to respect your choices, to support your dreams, to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to love you not as a possession but as a person, whole and complete in yourself. I promise that you will always be free, even as you are mine." Winifred's own vows were equally heartfelt, speaking of gratitude and love and the unexpected grace of second chances. When they kissed to seal their promises, it felt different from all their previous kisses, weighted with public acknowledgement and witnessed commitment. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful, with simple food and no speeches beyond Tom's gruff toast to two stubborn people who were smart enough to recognize a good thing when they found it. They danced in the main room, Fletcher surprisingly graceful as he led Winifred through a waltz, and for a few hours the ranch house was filled with warmth and laughter and hope. That night, alone in the room they now officially shared, Winifred reflected on the improbable journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate fugitive, fleeing an intolerable future with no clear plan beyond escape. Now she was a ranch wife, legally and genuinely bound to a man she loved and respected in equal measure. The path had been terrifying and uncertain, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. "Are you happy?" Fletcher asked, pulling her close in the darkness. "More than I ever thought possible," Winifred answered honestly. "Are you?" "Completely," he said, kissing her temple. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Winifred Walsh." "We happened to each other," she corrected, "and I am grateful for every moment." The first winter as a truly married couple tested them in ways Winifred had not anticipated. The snows came heavy and persistent, trapping them at the ranch for weeks at a time. The cattle required constant attention, and Fletcher often came back to the house so cold Winifred worried about frostbite. She learned to make soups that could stretch for days, to conserve firewood, to occupy herself during long hours of isolation. But there were also unexpected joys in the forced intimacy of winter. Long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, teaching Fletcher to play chess with a set she had brought from St. Louis. The luxury of lazy mornings on days when the weather was too brutal for outside work. They learned each other thoroughly during those months, not just physically, but in all the small ways that built true partnership. In February, Winifred realized she was pregnant. The realization came not with fear but with quiet excitement. She told Fletcher one evening after dinner, watching his face transform from surprise to wonder to fierce protectiveness. "A baby," he repeated, as though testing the words. "We are going to have a baby." "Is that all right?" Winifred asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we did not plan for this so soon." "All right." Fletcher pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of glass. "Winifred, it is more than all right. It is perfect." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, their voices overlapping with excitement and speculation. They would need to build a cradle, stock up on supplies before Winifred's confinement, arrange for a midwife from town. Fletcher was already planning modifications to the house, a nursery carved from what had been a storage room. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring, and Winifred found herself marveling at the changes in her body, the undeniable evidence of new life growing within her. Fletcher was attentive to the point of being overwhelming, constantly worried about her health and safety. Tom took over more of the heavy household work without being asked, gruffly claiming he did not want her straining herself. In early October, after a labor that lasted nearly a full day, Winifred gave birth to a healthy son. They named him Henry Thomas Walsh, honoring Fletcher's father and their loyal foreman. The moment Fletcher held his son for the first time, his expression one of awe and terror and overwhelming love, Winifred knew their family was complete in a way that had nothing to do with blood or obligation, and everything to do with choice and commitment. The years that followed were not easy, but they were rich with meaning and purpose. The ranch prospered gradually, each season bringing modest improvements. They added rooms to the house as their family grew. A daughter named Clara was born 2 years after Henry, followed by another son, Michael, 3 years after that. Tom remained with them, becoming an honorary uncle to the children who adored his gruff manner and endless patience for their questions. Winifred never returned to St. Louis, and after that final letter, her father made no further attempts at contact. She grieved the loss of that relationship in quiet moments, but refused to let it define her. Instead, she built her own family, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than control and expectation. She also discovered she had a talent for healing, studying from medical texts Fletcher ordered for her, and gradually becoming the person neighbors called when someone was sick or injured. It was not the medical degree she had once dreamed of, but it was a way of using her mind and skills to help others, and that gave her profound satisfaction. Fletcher aged into the role of husband and father with grace, his quiet strength the foundation on which their family was built. He never took for granted the choice Winifred had made to stay with him, to build this life together. On their 10th anniversary, he gave her a simple gold band to replace the plain wire one he had fashioned in those early days when their marriage was still fiction. "I love you," he said, sliding it onto her finger. "I loved you then when you were trying to escape. I loved you when you agreed to this crazy arrangement. I loved you when you kissed me in the yard, and I love you now more than I have words to express." "I love you too," Winifred said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You gave me passage west in your name, but more than that, you gave me freedom. You gave me the chance to choose my own life." "We gave each other that," Fletcher corrected, echoing her words from years before. "And I would make the same choice every time." Their children grew up strong and happy, learning the value of hard work and the importance of respecting others' autonomy. Henry showed an early aptitude for working with horses and seemed destined to take over the ranch eventually. Clara was curious and stubborn, constantly asking questions and demanding to know why things worked the way they did. Michael was quiet and thoughtful, spending hours watching the world with careful attention. As Winifred watched her children play in the yard one autumn afternoon, their laughter echoing off the mountains, she reflected on how far she had come from that desperate girl climbing through a window in St. Louis. She had been trying to escape, but what she had found was so much more than safety. She had found love and purpose and a life that was authentically hers. Fletcher came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Winifred said, leaning back into his embrace. "How lucky I was that you were in Black Hawk that day. How different my life could have been." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Fletcher said. "You were brave enough to run, brave enough to take a chance on a stranger's offer. Everything that came after we built together." He was right, of course. The life they had created was not the result of chance or rescue, but of mutual effort and shared commitment. Winifred had not been saved by Fletcher Walsh. She had partnered with him to save herself, to build something neither of them could have achieved alone. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the Walsh family gathered on the porch. Henry was talking about a new training technique he wanted to try with the young horses. Clara was planning an expedition to collect specimens from the creek, her goal to identify every plant and insect in the surrounding area. Michael sat quietly, listening to his siblings with a small smile. Fletcher pulled Winifred closer, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back. This was home, not the place but the people, the relationships built on trust and respect and genuine affection. This was the life she had been searching for without knowing it, the freedom she had dreamed of made tangible in mud and laughter and honest work. Years later, when their children were grown with families of their own, Winifred would tell her grandchildren the story of how she and Fletcher met. She would describe the muddy street in Black Hawk, the cowboy who offered passage west and his name, the fiction that became reality. The grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, asking if she was scared, if she missed her old life, if she ever regretted her choice. And Winifred would smile, taking Fletcher's weathered hand in hers, and say with absolute certainty, not for a single moment, "Your grandfather gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. He respected my right to choose. And I chose this, chose him, chose us. Every single day, I choose this life, and I would do it all again exactly the same way." Fletcher would squeeze her hand, his eyes crinkling with the same quiet affection that had drawn her to him decades before. And in that simple gesture was the entire story of their love. Steady, respectful, enduring. Not a fairy tale rescue, but a partnership built on mutual choice and sustained through countless small acts of devotion. The ranch passed to Henry eventually, though Fletcher and Winifred remained active well into their 70s, still walking the land they had built together. When Fletcher finally passed away at 82, Winifred grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 56 years together, half a century of shared life that had been richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined in that desperate night in St. Louis. She lived another 3 years after Fletcher's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the values she and Fletcher had instilled: integrity, hard work, respect for others, autonomy. When she died peacefully in her sleep at 85, the minister spoke at her funeral about a woman who had lived fully and courageously, who had chosen her own path and never looked back. But the greatest tribute came from her children, who gathered after the service to share memories. Henry spoke of his mother's determination and his father's steadfast support. Clara remembered her mother's curiosity and her father's patient willingness to help with endless experiments. Michael, always quiet, simply said that his parents had shown him what real love looked like: a partnership of equals, built on choice and sustained through respect. And in the end, that was the true legacy of Winifred and Fletcher Walsh. Not the ranch they built or the family they raised, though both were significant. Their legacy was the example they set, the proof that love built on freedom and mutual respect could not only survive but thrive, creating something beautiful and enduring that would ripple forward through generations. The story that began with a desperate flight on a cold March night in 1876 ended with a love that spanned decades and transformed countless lives. Winifred had been trying to escape, and Fletcher had given her passage west and his name. But what they had given each other was so much more: the freedom to choose, the courage to build, and the love that made it all worthwhile. And that, in the end, was everything.